Review of Joe Rogan and Lex Fridman's talk. Key themes and questions for the audience. In the latest edition of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, Lex Fridman and Joe Rogan discuss topics ranging from scientific hypotheses about life in space to the complex geopolitical issues surrounding the war in Ukraine. This conversation is full of humor, deep insights, and unexpected perspectives that make you think. Sex in space, scientific or curiosity? One of the first questions raised was a provocative one. Is it possible to have sex in zero gravity? Joe joked in his usual manner, wondering if ejaculation could be used as a means of transportation. Lex suggested a more scientific approach, explaining that the behavior of fluids in space is much different than on Earth, and it is extremely difficult to conceive a child in such conditions. What do you think is a technological solution to this problem possible in the near future? Visionaries, with Elon Musk believing that colonizing Mars is the path to humanity's survival, allowing for the creation of a self-sufficient civilization on another planet. While Jeff Bezos insists on building orbital stations, arguing that this is a more realistic way to live and work in space while remaining close to Earth. Rogan expressed skepticism about a Martian colony, noting the extreme conditions, radiation, and difficulty of supply. Fridman, for his part, noted that long-term space missions could accelerate technological breakthroughs in medicine and biology. They also talked about technical challenges, such as maintaining vital resources and creating artificial gravity. The question remains, which path to space exploration, colonizing Mars or building orbital stations, will prove more sustainable and practical in the long term? Historian or reformer? The topic of history occupied a significant part of the talk. Lex Fridman presented Genghis Khan not only as a great conqueror, but also as a reformer who introduced laws and promoted ideas of free trade, including easier transit of goods along the Silk Road. Joe, on the other hand, emphasized the brutality with which the Mongols conquered new territories, including massacres and destruction of cities, comparing their methods to war crimes of modern times. They also discussed Genghis Khan's impact on culture and how his legacy is viewed in different countries. History shows that time changes the way we look at figures of the past. Who do we see Genghis Khan as today, a wise ruler or a ruthless tyrant? War in Ukraine. Lex's personal perspective. Lex shared his personal story, as his parents are from Ukraine and he himself has visited Kiev many times. He talked about how the situation on the ground has affected his perception of the conflict, noting that people are suffering not only physically, but also morally. Lex highlighted the emotional state of Zelensky, who, in his opinion, is trying to remain resolute despite the enormous pressure. Joe expressed skepticism about the extent to which emotional decisions can interfere with rational negotiation, mentioning that compromises are inevitable to achieve peace. Fridman added that Western countries should take into account the realities of the region and offer solutions that actually work in practice. Rogan questioned whether diplomatic efforts could have prevented the conflict from escalating earlier, while Lex noted that the lack of trust between the parties remains the main obstacle. The role of the U.S., NATO, and Donald Trump in the conflict in Ukraine. Joe and Lex discussed in detail the influence of the U.S. and NATO on the course of the conflict in Ukraine, recalling how Western support has changed over time. Lex emphasized that arms deliveries and financial assistance played a key role but often lagged, giving Russia a tactical advantage. Rogan expressed the view that the U.S. could have acted more pragmatically, balancing support for Ukraine with maintaining diplomatic relations with Russia, especially in the early stages of the conflict. They also raised the issue of domestic pressures on Western leaders caused by public opinion and growing economic pressures. Lex pointed out the complexity of decision-making in a politically unstable environment, emphasizing that NATO acts on the basis of long-term strategic interests, not just helping Ukraine. Special attention was paid to Donald Trump and his influence on the situation. Lex believes that his deal-oriented and threat-based approach to foreign policy could play a significant role in possible negotiations. Rogan, however, noted that Trump's instability and his ambiguous relationship with world leaders could make the negotiation process unpredictable. They discussed how world politics often depends on a leader's personality and approach to international relations. Finally, they agreed that the role of the U.S. and NATO remains key, but the approach must consider the balance between military support and diplomacy. Lex's personal safety. Fridman recognizes that his work carries enormous risks, especially in the context of current geopolitical tensions. He is planning an interview with Vladimir Putin, aware of the potential threats, including cyber attacks, surveillance, and pressure from various stakeholders. Lex noted that such interviews are necessary to understand the other point of view and find ways to dialogue. Joe expressed his admiration for Lex's courage, noting that such moves require tremendous courage and a strategic approach to security. They also discussed the moral aspects of journalism. Lex noted that in today's environment, a journalist must balance between revealing the truth and preserving personal safety, especially when it comes to sensitive topics. He emphasized that objectivity often requires sacrifice, and pressure from authorities and public opinion can make the job difficult. Joe, for his part, noted that many journalists are forced to self-censor to avoid repercussions, which raises the question of freedom of speech and its true price. Artificial intelligence and the future of warfare. Joe and Lex discussed how artificial intelligence is transforming modern warfare. Lex expressed concern that autonomous decision-making systems, such as drones and robotic troops, could lower the threshold for initiating conflict because the human element is eliminated. He emphasized that ceding control to machines could lead to irreversible consequences, where life and death decisions would be made by algorithms without human intervention. Joe, for his part, emphasized that the development of AI will lead to an arms race in which countries will compete for technological superiority. He noted that historically such competitions have always ended in global crises, and the development of AI in the military sphere requires global regulation. Rogan also expressed concern that in the absence of strict laws, such technology could fall into the hands of terrorists, leading to low-cost attacks on civilian targets. They also touched on the moral aspects. Who is responsible for the actions of autonomous weapons? Lex noted that the potential use of AI for military purposes raises questions of ethics and law, as well as possible scenarios of uncontrolled proliferation of technology. He stressed that governments must develop strict controls and regulations to minimize the risks of abuse. Fridman expressed fears that countries without advanced technology could be at a disadvantage, leading to a new round of global inequality. He also mentioned that major technology companies are already working on solutions that could limit autonomous systems in military conflicts. Rogan emphasized that the technological race is already underway, and in the future we may face wars with minimal human involvement, which will change the very nature of conflicts. Conclusion. This talk covered many topics, from space to politics, from history to technology. Joe and Lex raised many interesting questions that make us think about the future of humanity. Discussions ranged from the ethical dilemmas associated with advances in technology to the social aspects of global conflict. They touched on topics that affect all of us: security, moral choices, the impact of social media, and the role of leaders in shaping our world. This podcast has become not just a conversation, but an invitation for reflection, and each listener can find important insights that can change the way they look at familiar things.